soldiers of mob truth. Welcome back. And to those of you watching for the first time, this is more than a channel. It's a family. Here, every subscriber becomes part of the crew. Together, we dive into the blood, the money, and the secrets of the mafia. So hit that subscribe button now and take your oath. Because once you're in, there's no turning back. Week after week, we reveal the real faces of organized crime. The bosses, the soldiers, the betrayals. This is history carved in bullets and cement. And tonight, we open a new chapter. The name that made Chicago tremble, the man the newspapers branded public enemy #1, a legend, feared by rivals and worshipped by his own. His name, Marie, was Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899. The son of Italian immigrants, he grew up in a tough neighborhood where gangs ruled the streets. School never held his interest. Fists and hustle did. By the age of 14, Capone dropped out after striking a teacher, and the streets became his classroom. Brooklyn was crawling with gangs. The 5 Points Gang, the Junior 40 Thieves. Young Capone gravitated toward them. He learned quickly that survival meant toughness, loyalty, and knowing when to strike. His scarred face came from a barroom fight, a wound that earned him the nickname Scarface, a name he despised but one that marked him for life. It was in New York that Capone crossed paths with Johnny Torrio, a seasoned gangster who spotted potential in the young tough. Torrio wasn't just a street fighter, he was a strategist, a businessman in crime. Under his mentorship, Capone learned the value of patience, organization, and the power of influence. By his late teens, Capone's reputation in Brooklyn was solid, but his future wasn't in New York. Torrio's move to Chicago opened the door to a new world. Capone followed, first working small jobs, bouncing at a brothel, collecting debts, and handling protection. But there was something different about him. Unlike many gangsters, Capone could blend violence with charm. He shook hands with politicians, shared jokes with reporters, and presented himself as a man of the people. To neighbors, he was generous. To rivals, he was merciless. In Chicago, the Prohibition era was exploding. Alcohol was outlawed, but the thirst for liquor was unstoppable. Torrio's crew seized the moment, running bootleg operations, bribing police, and keeping judges in their pockets. Capone quickly rose in rank, proving himself as more than muscle. He understood the business side of crime, and he embraced it. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone was Torrio's right hand. His mix of brains, brutality, and charisma made him indispensable. The boy from Brooklyn was no longer just another soldier in the underworld. He was becoming a force, and Chicago was beginning to feel the weight of his presence. Capone's rise in Chicago was steady, calculated, and relentless. At first, he handled the dirty work, breaking heads, collecting protection money, and making sure Torrio's orders were carried out without question. But it didn't take long for his presence to be felt far beyond the street corners. What set Capone apart wasn't just his fists. He had a gift for reading people. He knew when to intimidate with violence and when to charm with a smile. Reporters liked him because he gave them headlines. Local families liked him because he handed out turkeys on holidays. But his enemies learned a different lesson. When Capone gave his word, you obeyed or you disappeared. By the early 1920s, Chicago was a battlefield. Rival gangs fought over bootlegging routes and speakeasy profits. Bombings became so common that Chicago newspapers reported them as casually as car accidents. In the middle of this chaos, Capone thrived. He worked his way into Torrio's inner circle, managing nightclubs, gambling joints, and brothels. The money poured in, and with every dollar, Capone's influence grew. Judges, aldermen, and policemen all found themselves on the payroll. The law didn't scare Capone, the law worked for him. Still, he was young and hungry. Torrio had built the empire, but Capone was learning how to expand it. Every handshake with a politician, every bribe to a cop, and every speakeasy opened under his watch turned him from a street brawler into something much more dangerous, a businessman in crime. Yet power always breeds enemies. Rival gangs despised Torrio's dominance, and with Capone rising in profile, the threats only multiplied. Every corner of Chicago seemed ready to explode, and in 1925, it did. The rise of Al Capone. In January of 1925, Chicago's underworld turned into open war. The North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion's successors, wasn't about to let Torrio and Capone control the city's liquor trade without a fight. Ambushes, drive-bys, and bombings became daily news. Johnny Torrio himself became a marked man. One winter afternoon, as Torrio stepped out of his car after shopping with his wife, a group of gunmen closed in. They fired at him at point-blank range. Bullets tore through his body, leaving him bleeding and clinging to life. By some miracle, Torrio survived, but his time was over. Lying in a hospital bed, wrapped in bandages, Torrio made a decision. Chicago wasn't worth dying for. He wanted peace, a quiet life, and an escape from the constant threat of assassination. Before stepping away, he called for his most trusted protege, Al Capone. At just 26 years old, Capone was handed the keys to Chicago's criminal empire. Torrio retired to Italy, and Capone became the boss. Overnight, the young gangster from Brooklyn transformed into the most powerful man in Chicago. But power came at a price. Every rival wanted his head. The police kept him in their sights, and reporters followed his every move. Capone didn't shrink from the pressure. He thrived on it. He set up headquarters at the Lexington Hotel, surrounding himself with bodyguards armed like soldiers. His name carried both fear and respect. To some, he was a ruthless mobster. To others, a modern Robin Hood who spread money through the city during hard times. But behind the charm and public image was cold steel. Capone understood that control of Chicago meant ruling through both generosity and terror. Anyone who opposed him found themselves silenced, sometimes in the most brutal ways imaginable. By the end of 1925, Capone was no longer a rising star. He was the undisputed ruler of Chicago's underworld, and the city would never be the same. Capone wasted no time tightening his grip on Chicago. He reorganized Torrio's operations, streamlining the bootlegging empire like a corporation. Trucks carried whiskey across the city, guarded by gunmen with shotguns and Tommy guns. Dozens of speakeasies paid tribute directly to him, and every bottle sold was another brick in his empire. But liquor was only part of the business. Capone expanded into gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets. He took control of nightclubs and brothels, raking in millions while the police looked the other way. Those who couldn't be bribed learned quickly that Capone's reach extended far beyond money. Intimidation, beatings, and sudden disappearances kept the opposition in line. Capone also understood the importance of public image. He dressed in expensive suits, wore diamond jewelry, and tipped waiters with $100 bills. Reporters loved him because he made headlines. To ordinary Chicagoans, he looked like a celebrity, a man who outsmarted the system and shared his wealth. On Thanksgiving, he gave away truckloads of food to the poor. On Christmas, children received gifts with his name attached. But beneath the polished smile was a man who ruled by fear. Drive-by shootings lit up the streets. Bombings destroyed rival businesses. Ordinary citizens lived with the sound of gunfire echoing in their neighborhoods. Capone's Chicago was a city where money bought power and violence enforced it. The police were hopelessly outmatched. Judges were bought, politicians were owned, and anyone who dared to challenge the outfit quickly found themselves in a coffin. Capone had become more than a gangster. He was the law of Chicago's underworld. Yet the higher he climbed, the more enemies he created. The North Side Gang refused to bow down, and bloody battles erupted across the city. Each week, bodies piled up, and the newspapers counted the dead. Chicago was no longer just a city, it was a war zone, with Al Capone at the center. By 1926, Chicago's streets were soaked in blood. The newspapers called it the Beer Wars, a battle for control of the city's illegal liquor. At the heart of it stood Al Capone and his outfit against the North Side Gang. The North Siders struck first. They staged ambushes, riddled Capone's convoys with bullets, and tried to cut off his supply lines. But Capone was never caught unprepared. His men rode in armored cars carrying sawed-off shotguns and the latest Thompson submachine guns. Every attack was answered with greater force. Shootings became a daily reality. Bombs ripped through storefronts owned by rivals. Dozens of bodies turned up in alleys, their deaths a silent warning to anyone who dared cross Capone. Yet in the middle of this chaos, he walked through Chicago like a king. He dined in the finest restaurants, tipped the band to play his favorite songs, and waved to reporters who followed his every move. Despite his violent empire, Capone understood the value of appearances. He bought seats at prize fights, sat in the front row of theaters, and donated money to charities. Some Chicagoans despised him. Others admired him, believing he gave back more than the politicians who claimed to represent them. But the violence couldn't be ignored. The North Side gang struck closer and closer, and Capone knew one mistake could mean his end. For protection, he surrounded himself with a wall of bodyguards. He rarely traveled without a convoy of armed cars, and the Lexington Hotel became his fortress. Chicago was a city divided, speakeasies booming with life on one side, morgues filling with bodies on the other. And at only 27 years old, Al Capone stood in the center of it all, the ruthless ruler of an empire built on liquor, fear, and blood. As Capone's power grew, so did his visibility. Chicago's newspapers couldn't get enough of him. Every raid, every shootout, every whisper of his name became front-page news. To the public, he was more than a gangster. He was a larger-than-life figure who seemed untouchable. Capone played the part well. He gave interviews, smiled for photographs, and even claimed that he was just a businessman providing what the people wanted. "I give the public what they demand," he told reporters, brushing off accusations of violence. It was a lie everyone could see through. But in a city drowning in corruption, who was going to stop him? Behind the headlines, Capone's organization tightened its control. Speakeasies flourished under his protection. Rival saloons either paid up or burned down. Trucks carrying illegal whiskey rumbled through Chicago night after night, guarded by men ready to shoot without hesitation. Yet even as Capone built his image as a generous, smiling kingpin, the streets told another story. Ordinary citizens lived in fear of stray bullets. Car bombs shattered storefronts. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds as rival gangs tried to claw back control. Capone understood the cost of power. Every new territory won meant more enemies to fight. But he never showed weakness. He moved openly through the city, holding court in the lobby of the Lexington Hotel, as if daring anyone to try and kill him. By the late 1920s, Al Capone had transformed from Torrio's young apprentice into Chicago's most feared and most famous mob boss. His rise was complete, but the war for Chicago was only just beginning. Capone's rule in Chicago was more than violence. It was strategy. He knew that fear alone couldn't hold an empire. He needed allies in high places, judges were paid off, police captains were slipped envelopes of cash, and aldermen turned a blind eye in exchange for a cut of the profits. With politics in his pocket, Capone's reach extended from the alleys of the South Side all the way into City Hall. Still, the streets never slept. Rival gangs continued their assaults, hoping to shatter his grip. The North Side hit his men in ambushes, gunning them down at intersections, bombing his warehouses, and spreading terror of their own. But Capone always struck back harder. Drive-by shootings left bodies in cars slumped over steering wheels. Entire crews vanished overnight, their names erased from the Chicago underworld. Yet even as blood ran in the gutters, Capone projected confidence. He was often seen at ball games, shaking hands with politicians, laughing with reporters who were desperate for a quote. He played both gangster and celebrity, a man who could order a killing with one hand while signing autographs with the other. His wealth grew to staggering levels. His organization was pulling in tens of millions each year, unimaginable sums for the time. He invested in nightclubs, gambling dens, and even legitimate businesses, laundering his fortune through every corner of the city. But success brought new dangers. Rival gangs hardened their attacks. Law enforcement began feeling public pressure to act, and whispers of betrayal lurked within his own ranks. Capone's rise had been fast and brutal, and everyone in Chicago wondered how long a man so powerful could hold on to his throne. Capone's fortune and influence made him a household name, but behind the headlines was a man balancing two worlds. At home, he was a husband and father, keeping a quiet residence in Cicero away from the chaos of downtown Chicago. To his neighbors, he seemed polite, even generous. But once he stepped back into the city, the other Capone emerged. The ruthless boss who would stop at nothing to protect his empire. His network of men stretched across every block. Trusted lieutenants handled the flow of liquor, while brutal enforcers made sure debts were collected. Capone rewarded loyalty handsomely, but betrayal was dealt with quickly and without mercy. Those who crossed him often vanished, their names whispered in fear, but never spoken in court. By now, his operations were running like a business empire. Trucks delivered Canadian whiskey, speakeasies operated under coded signals, and profits were counted by the millions. Even the police, who should have been breaking his empire apart, were often found guarding it. Corruption had spread so deep that ordinary citizens wondered if anyone in power truly wanted Capone stopped. Still, the violence never ended. Battles with the North Side Gang raged on, turning Chicago into a war zone. Cars sped down streets with men leaning out of windows, firing Thompson's submachine guns at rivals. Bombings shattered entire blocks. Families learned to dive for cover when engines roared past at night. Capone didn't just survive this storm, he thrived in it. Each attempt on his life only made him more determined. He traveled with convoys of bodyguards, wore bulletproof vests under his suits, and surrounded himself with an army of loyal men who would take a bullet for him without hesitation. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone wasn't just another gangster. He was the face of Chicago, feared, respected, and untouchable in the eyes of many. But the wars weren't over. The city was spiraling deeper into chaos, and Capone was standing at the center of the fire, ready to claim more power than ever before. By 1927, Capone's grip on Chicago was ironclad. His name carried weight in every corner of the city, from the slums of Cicero to the polished offices of downtown. Politicians feared him, judges relied on his money, and police captains knew better than to cross him. But with every gain, the North Side Gang pushed harder. Bugs Moran and his men had sworn to bring Capone down. Their raids hit liquor shipments, their gunmen hunted outfit soldiers, and their bombings shook entire neighborhoods. Chicagoans woke each morning to fresh headlines of shootings and explosions, and almost all of it led back to the war between Capone's outfit and Moran's gang. Capone answered with overwhelming force. His men patrolled the streets in armored cars, carrying machine guns that turned city blocks into killing fields. Speakeasies loyal to the North Side were smashed to pieces. Businesses that resisted his protection rackets found themselves in ruins by dawn. Fear wasn't just a weapon for Capone, it was a language, and the whole city understood it. Yet while the violence raged, Capone played another role in public. He attended baseball games, handed out large tips, and gave interviews as if he were a celebrity rather than a criminal. He was seen at charity events, feeding the poor and giving money to struggling families. To some, he was a villain. To others, he was a hero who lived larger than life. Still, behind the sharp suits and wide smile, Capone never forgot the danger surrounding him. He rarely traveled without convoys of armed guards. Bulletproof cars carried him from one side of Chicago to the other. Inside the Lexington Hotel, he lived like a general in wartime, guarded day and night by loyal men who would kill at his command. The city was now a powder keg, split between admiration and fear, wealth and bloodshed. And standing above it all was Al Capone, the boy from Brooklyn who had risen higher, faster, and more violently than anyone before him. His rise was complete, but the wars tearing Chicago apart were only sharpening for what came next. Capone's empire was now bringing in an estimated $100 million a year, a staggering figure for the 1920s. Every glass of bootleg whiskey poured in Chicago seemed to trace back to his network. His lieutenants managed speakeasies across the city, his accountants laundered fortunes through businesses, and his soldiers enforced the rules with violence. But power on this scale could never stay quiet. Federal agents in Washington began to take notice. Prohibition had created a new breed of crime, and Capone's name became the symbol of everything the government claimed it was fighting against. In Chicago, though, officials often looked the other way, bribed, threatened, or simply too afraid to act. For ordinary citizens, life under Capone's rule was a contradiction. On one hand, liquor flowed freely, speakeasies buzzed with music and dancing, and many working families found jobs tied to his empire. On the other, the constant gunfire and bombings turned Chicago into a city living under siege. Mothers kept children inside after dark, and shopkeepers prayed their businesses wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. Capone himself walked a dangerous line. He relished the spotlight, speaking to reporters and flashing his wealth. He once said, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want." But behind that charm was a man at war. Every handshake could mask betrayal. Every smiling face could belong to an assassin. The North Side gang refused to bow. Their attacks grew bolder, their hatred deeper. Moran and his gunmen knew that to bring Capone down, they would need patience and precision. Capone, in turn, plotted his next moves carefully, building alliances, reinforcing his army, and preparing for a strike that would send shockwaves across the country. The rise of Al Capone was no longer just a Chicago story. It was becoming a national obsession, and soon his name would be feared far beyond the city limits. This was episode 27 of Mob Truth. Al Capone, Part 1. The Rise. Soldiers, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join the family. Every week we bring you deeper into the real history of the Mafia. And once you're in, you're one of us. And remember, this story has only just begun. Stay tuned for Part 2, where Al Capone tightens his grip on Chicago, faces his bloodiest battles, and cements his place as the most feared mob boss in America. Welcome to Mob Truth. The family is growing, and you're part of it now.